I'll just see if I can do it alongside. There we go. And we'll pop the captions on as well. If I find the button to do that. So a huge welcome. It's so wonderful to see you on this Tuesday as we head towards the end of June. I think according to LinkedIn or something, or Eventbrite, this is our 76th virtual event now that we've hosted. And I know what you're thinking, shouldn't you be getting good at this by now? But as Anna said earlier, we're always work in progress. And I think there's a part of us that never wants to be that good. We want to be real. And we want to just create these kind of spaces where we can really examine, the narratives that are happening around us on social media and in conversations in our works, schools, and homes. So this is the second of our summits that we've put together. I have to say I was helped enormously with this by Shivam, and I just want to put a mention out there as well in terms of shaping how do we put this event together that would connect the myriad of today's challenges, opportunities, and wonders, which is the changing business models across the world, the focus on sustainability, and the role of technologies, particularly emerging technologies, and especially artificial intelligence. And how do we relate that to such topics such as going beyond GDP? Shivam, do you want to just say a quick hello and just put, hey, David, and put your stamp on this really in terms of what does it mean to you today and what do you think we can achieve today?
What an easy question to start the conversation with. Easy. No. It's lovely to be here, and thank you again, Richard and the team, for putting this event together. So from my vantage point, I'm with the United Nations Environment Program, and I'm the senior advisor to the digital transformation team. The whole premise behind the existence of our team is to really understand what is the role that digital tech can play in supporting the countries across the world. So we've got 193 countries, 6 regions, in enabling them to advance their environmental action in a more data-driven, in a more user-driven manner. And that conversation really is trying to move the dial away from a more prescriptive way of undertaking things, which has been the norm for a very long time in the world of impact and tech, where we have a tendency to go to the different regions of the countries. We take a technology to them and say, this is the tech, and this is what you need to do. Or this is the problem that you're facing, this is the answer. And that has not really worked well. That is because that we have not taken into account the actual needs of the end user. More importantly, we have not taken into account the full implications of the pros and the cons that the digital technologies present. And so for us, what we're trying to move away from or move towards is away from this prescriptive way towards a more descriptive way, where we can take the full account of the user that we're working with on the ground and create technologies to really meet their needs ultimately. And moving away from this idea of technology being the answer to technology being the tool that can help us answer the questions that we want to answer. So that is a very important differentiation factor. We're moving away from the narrative where tech is the answer to how can we take the agency of using tech in intelligent ways. AI being one example of the emerging tech that is certainly a part of this conversation. So that's where sort of we are having some exciting conversation. And that is really what I'm hoping we can drive this conversation through is, what is the role of tech? How do we take agency off tech rather than giving agency to tech? And then more importantly, how do we take those conversations to drive conversations on enabling system shifts that include the economy to enable better environmental outcomes, but more importantly, social outcomes as well. So sorry that took a bit of a screen time, but just really wanting to resonate the importance of this conversation in today's time, and excited to hear what we come up with.
Shivam, we invited you to take up some of our screen time, so you definitely don't need to apologize for it. I see David Symes here, and I'll do a proper start to this event in a minute, I promise. I'm just so happy to see everybody. David, it's great to have your company. I wasn't sure if you would come around today. I don't know if you were listening to Shivam speaking there, or if maybe you were multitasking, so I don't want to put you on the spot. But was there ever a time when people did think technology was the answer? Did we go through a phase and come back out of it, or have we always known this?
I think we pass in and out of these phases constantly, Richard, because there's times when we see the newest and greatest technology as the solution to everything, as we're getting to, with AI, but also potentially the risk and problem for everything, as we're getting to with AI. And we've already been through that shift with the metaverse, and we've been through that shift with everything, right back to television and the radiogram, where it's like, this is great, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and then everybody starts worrying about it. And then we start getting into the real use cases, the real world use cases, and realize that the reality is a bit more nuanced than that. And usually the newest technology is something which has to be worked with other more traditional approaches or other technologies, and it's just not as black and white as people think it is. So I think that, and that I would always say this as a marketer, and sorry everybody, I am a marketer, first and foremost, 70% of any communication and marketing is research, right? It's understanding what are the requirements of people, and then, and only then, working out the solution. So instead of wandering around with a big square peg and trying to hammer it into any hole given, like we do tend to do with new technologies, we ultimately end up with a large collection of chopsticks which will fit in any given hole. Or we work out what shape the hole is first, and then we craft the peg to fit it. So these are the right solutions, and this is what inevitably transpires once you get past the early adoption phase. I hope that answers your question. That was a bit of a highly caffeinated response from me.
You coffeeed up, are you?
Oh yeah, this time of day. Oh yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant, David. Thanks for being here. Paul, you just wanted to wait a little bit, but I want to just do some introductions. Let everybody know who's in the room. So first of all, you're absolutely all 100% welcome. Please do keep your cameras on if you wish. I see some very friendly faces, not places. I see me, Novak's here. I see Karen's here, Manojay's here, Thomas is here. I see Sophie's arrived as well. I'm just looking at the cameras at the moment, to be fair, and obviously do give me a wave. So I think everybody probably knows this, but we don't come together here to say what the answer is or prove who's the smartest in the room. We all already know it's definitely not me. So I have a degree in drama, by the way, so it's very easy to have these meetings because I have nothing to prove. I'm already the dumbest guy in the room, so it's liberating. And so I just start my day with that thought. Joined by a cast of wonderful, brilliant people who have prepared some thoughts for us in advance. And I see many of them on the screen. So if I can get Sophie to give me a wave from UNEP as well. Sophie's back. This is Back to the Future Part 2 with Sophie joining us again, which is wonderful. So great to see you again. You've met Shivam already. I think everybody sees a different grid, so there's pretty much no point me pointing. I had to look at Pratap's photo for a while to work out whether it's a still image or if he's standing very, very still. And on hindsight, I think it's an image. You're very welcome. So we're also joined by Henry. Henry's down at the bottom of my screen. Great to see you, Henry, joining us from South Africa. We have apologies for Mariana today, but I'm sure as a team we'll be able to cover for her extremely well. And not only that, I'm joined by Jerry from MKAI, give a wave, who's ready to introduce our invited guests as well. I'm joined by Jaisal, who's prepared some questions for today to elaborate and expand our thinking. I'm just racking my brain to make sure that I'm not forgetting anybody. But we've been round. We're looking for Amanda, is another of our invited guests. There you are. You're right at the top of my screen, so you're very welcome. And we invited Paul as well. Paul's a regular at these forums on today's summit, playing the role of the animateur. And we truly value Paul's insights and the way that he challenges as well, because I think what's key here is that we want to have an event that is different. And Paul says this so beautifully, and something that you wouldn't just read on LinkedIn. We love LinkedIn, but something different and something that allows a different kind of narrative to emerge and a different way of speaking, perhaps. And Paul's here to keep us on track for the topic, which is going beyond GDP today, with reflections on AI, business models, and sustainability. but also, to be frank, to make sure that we stay lively and we stay interesting in this conversation and we don't go off at tangents and it doesn't get too dull, really, Paul. So you're the man, you're the sort of stand-up compare here, really, aren't you, to make sure that we're having a great time. You're very welcome, Paul. Good to see you.
Thank you. And actually, the reason I just wandered off camera for a moment was I'd forgotten my prop. So this is a large bag of charcoal that is right next to me as I sit here in my garden. And for twice the price, a good salesman, it wasn't David, but I'm sure it used a lot of David's skills, told me I shouldn't be buying charcoal, I should be buying coconut shells. Twice the price, much more environmentally friendly. Either way, when it gets a bit cold later, I shall be burning that stuff with probably guilt in my heart generally. Even as I was just updating a bit of my own research, it was in 2018 an article hit my inbox that talked about what are the most energy efficient languages, Richard. And I don't know if you knew, but in 2018, C+ was at the top as the most energy efficient programming language, and down at the bottom along with Perl is Python. And 2022 it's just been upgraded, 3 years for innovation, and Python is still pretty much at the bottom of the league. And it's just maybe a salutary reminder for us to tragically smile as we get to grips with these difficult questions, that every time you press a key, I mean, you might be lucky, it might be coming from wind power, but the likelihood is oil or coal is still burning to enable your laptop to finally produce its AI genius. And that's a challenge for us as well, to look at how we innovate, how we use technology, but also how we make the technologies we're using to help solve climate action problems and climate change. We have to make them greener as well.
Oh, thank you. You never quite know what mood Paul's going to be in. You spin the wheel. So if you want to join Paul later on, go over to your apps on the right, click the button, click the smello button there, and you'll be able to smell Paul's coconut fire later on. So we can all enjoy that. Paul, you're very, very welcome, as I say. Jerry, a quick hello from you and some thanks for Data Reply, I think, for supporting our organization, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Richard. Data Reply is a subsidiary of the Reply Group that provides a variety of analytics and data processing services. They work directly with executive level professionals and chief executive officers across various industries and business functions to enable them to achieve meaningful outcomes through the effective use of data. Data Reply assists businesses in designing and implementing human-centered data products in order to help develop enterprise solutions from embryonic concepts. Furthermore, they intend to manage trade-offs between business requirements and technical constraints by developing comprehensive data architectures and ensuring data security and protection. Data Reply has strong competencies in big data engineering, data science, RPA, IPA. They construct big data platforms and implement machine learning and artificial intelligence models in a repeatable, efficient, scalable, simple, and secure manner, and assist businesses in combinatorial optimization processes using quantum computing techniques that enable a high-performance computing engine, Richard.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That's a wonderful intro, and we thank Data Reply for their kind but hands-off support as well. We are very careful how we take money in this organization. They're a wonderful organization. So I want to just remind about this energy that we have here. So it's more about coming to broaden our perspectives. That's the whole point of why we do this. Obviously, we don't charge. We're all here on a voluntary basis to expand the conversations that we can have around these vital topics. I would greatly encourage everyone to use the chat facility, despite what Paul Levy said about don't type on your keyboard, it'll burn more coal. But if we can just burn a bit more coconut, I would love to see the chat lighting up tonight. Let's start with some introductions. So just put in who you are and where you're from in terms of where you're currently located or where you identify from. And then why not pop your LinkedIn URL as well in there so we get a feel of who's here and we can connect with one another, and who knows what collaborations could spark from doing that. But if there's nothing else, I will remind us that we're here today to talk about how climate action and technology can drive a new era of prosperity. and Shivam, I'm sure, can keep helping me out here, but we're seeing cities and countries around the world that are thinking beyond GDP. GDP is a bit of an odd way of looking at the world. Sophie, are you able to say why GDP is a bit of an odd metric to use in 2023? Or am I putting you on the spot? Maybe Henry.
Not at all, Richard. Not at all. Good to see you, and good to see everyone here on the call today. No, I mean, we're just past that, right? I mean, we've gotten to a point where there is a global recognition and a political recognition that sustainability and human well-being are core factors of people, prosperity, and the planet, and the way that we live and engage with each other. And it's so fundamental beyond economic growth. And so the fact that we are still, how many years are we after the 8 years after the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're still tracking everything on the basis of GDP at a global scale, right? So just that in and of itself, I mean, the conversations have been there. Sustainability, circular economy, all of these concepts have been around for quite a while. Rio Plus 20 established sustainable consumption and production in 2012, right? And we're still talking about tracking primarily on the basis of GDP. So these conversations that we're having today, and conversations in general that are happening in the environmental space around how do we move forward on more socially and planetary conscious growth models is quite interesting, and I think essential today. But definitely, I mean, we're about 1 or 2 generations past having to use GDP, right? I think we need to step into the future and start looking at what is it actually that we value as people, and how do we take our planet forward.
Yeah, we're in danger of having a big old hangover, aren't we, from the party? Amanda, why does it feel such a big leap then to go from these cities and countries like Vancouver and others that are thinking this way, that leap from country to company? It seems quite a hard bridge at the moment, doesn't it, to wrap our minds around. Amanda, do you see it that way, or is it a smaller leap perhaps than I'm describing?
I mean, I think that it's all ultimately interconnected, right? Because if you're starting from the point of GDP having been used as like the dominant metric of progress for societies, I mean, that just tells you really about like the level of economic output that you have, sort of like price times quantity, things like this. And so, I mean, maybe I'll share, it might be helpful to share, I think, based on what Shivam was saying, like, I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I got into this, because I think it'll give some context for where I'm coming from with this discussion as well, because I don't come from the tech background. But so I worked in international development for a long time as well. And I worked specifically in industrial policy, because that was sort of the like last bastion against neoliberalism, in the sense that it was the space where governments were still meant to be protecting and promoting certain economic activities and behaviors in line with their development goals. And at that time, I would say that the dominant sort of consensus was just that implicit assumption was that your goal is economic growth or export competitiveness. And so really the recipe is then skills, tech, finance, right? Like, how do you increase productivity? How do you increase efficiency? How do you maximize profits? How do you generate wealth? With the idea that either that's going to magically trickle down and make everything better, or be taken by the state through taxes to fix the damages that were done to people and planet in the process, right? Because the best way that you're going to increase production very quickly is through systematic extraction of and exploitation of people and planet. And so this swap and this beyond GDP movement is really about recognizing that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy, and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so once you move beyond GDP and you develop social and ecological indicators for success, then that becomes the metric by which to evaluate your economy's success, to evaluate your technology success, to evaluate your business's success, right? And those are very different metrics, because then it's no longer just about how much profitability can technology generate, right? But how much is it genuinely contributing to the regeneration of our planet, to a more equitable and like society, to more human connection or senses of belonging, etc. So I think that that's where the connections are all based, and it is a big it's ultimately about a paradigm shift, but it does start from that highest level of what is our North Star, and therefore what kind of businesses are we going to want to encourage and reward, and why.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll ask Jerry to provide the introductions in just a moment in terms of everybody's bios. But I think it's nice just to kind of greet you and meet you as we are at this point as well. And Henry, it's great to say hello to you as well. So Amanda, Shivam, Sophie, Henry are invited contributors today. So obviously we want to hear what their prepared thoughts are, and then I'm sure we can open this up to more greater dialogue. Henry, it's easy, isn't it, to kind of sit in a certain lofty position and say, okay, we're ready for circular economy now, we're ready to go beyond GDP. And it's easy to say that when you feel that you've got all that stuff already. And that's certainly not the case around the world. And we're wrestling with some very different challenges in different places. I've met you a couple of times now, and you strike me as somebody who, if you wish to be a capitalist, you would probably be driving a very big car and a very big house, given the potential that you hold to do those kind of things. But you're obviously powered by different motivations. What's getting you out of bed at the moment, Henry, and what's driving your work in this context of moving beyond some of these old-fashioned metrics?
Thanks, Richard, and good evening, everyone. Good morning to some of us. Yeah, it's what drives me is we live on a planet that's in danger of, how do I put it, not of the planet disappearing, but of us disappearing off that planet due to our actions over the last few hundred years. So what drives me is doing that little bit that I can to see how we can change systems to shift from where we are to something better. I wouldn't even want to try and guess what the better would look like, because if you just look at the tech world, and I'm not from the tech world, things move so quickly you can barely blink and something new has arrived in your inbox about some new tech that's taking the world by storm. So it's also from a developing country perspective or economy perspective. Like you said, you know, it's easy in the global north to say, let's go circular, let's do all these great things, which make a lot of sense. But where you're sitting and where I'm sitting are two different things altogether. Where you're sitting, you have the ability and the capability to make those changes. And you have the economic muscle behind you to make those changes. The changes. Where I'm sitting, we don't have that. We may have capability to do certain things, but in terms of financial muscle to enable, and that's the key thing. Yeah, it's not just about money. It's money is a tool to an end, or a means to an end. And if you don't have sufficient amounts of it, all your good intentions won't really matter, because how are you going to make them happen? So you have to think a little bit more creatively. I'm not saying there isn't an opportunity in that, but let's be creative in how we then try and address these problems. So from a developing economy perspective, I think that's what almost lets us do things differently to everyone else. And everyone talks about leapfrogging. I'm not too keen on leapfrogging. I'm much more keen on, let's not commit the same mistakes as the global north. Let's learn from them, and let's look inward.
There's our online meeting webinar.
You know, understand what's important to our economy, our economic growth, our people. And that's the beauty for me about a circular economy, because that's what I'm trying to develop here, is let's put people at the center. And just quickly, a phrase that comes to mind, I heard it from Kumin Naidu, former head of Greenpeace, at a conference I was at here in South Africa. And he was saying, you know, the world, we're all looking to save the world and the planet. But what we should be doing is looking to save humanity. Because when we are gone, the planet's going to readjust and it's going to carry on without us. So what is our primary driver as a species? Then we need to focus on what do we need to do to make this world inhabitable, if that's good, yeah, but for us as a species as well. And that changes your perspective of how you address greening of the planet, if you would. Thanks, Richard. I hope
Henry,
that was
you.
what you're looking for.
You're always what I'm looking for, Henry. It's perfect. Yeah, I love your points, and we talk about what Greenpeace talked about, saving the whales, saving the bees, but it almost sounds like we're trying to save them from some external thing. Like, no, we're killing them. So
Exactly.
we're not heroes here, right? No, Henry, it's great to have you with us today. Jerry, could you do Shubham's introduction, please, so we get a better feel of him and his work?
I'd love to, Richard. Joining us from Vancouver, Canada, our first panelist in his current role with the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, is co-leading efforts to enable key systems level shifts necessary for accelerating sustainability using digital technologies. He's working to co-develop UNEP's digital transformation strategy for scaling up the use of digital technologies to accelerate action in addressing climate action, nature protection, and pollution prevention. Currently, he's also serving as UNEP's representative to the Coalition for Digital Environment Sustainabilities, CODES, within the Secretary-General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. He's also an early-stage impact investor focused on supporting technology ventures that intersect rural resiliency, public health, and urban sustainability. As a yoga instructor and mindfulness coach, he places empathy and compassion as core values that guide his interactions, choices, and decisions. He's an advisor, mentor, and investor for startups. He holds a master's in sustainability from Harvard. He's a senior advisor on digital transformation at UNEP, and as a globally minded catalyzer, he's carved a niche at the crossroads of innovation and socio-environmental sustainability. He has a senior leadership experience in both private and public sectors, including EY, Deloitte, and the City of Vancouver, where he's led the development and execution of sustainability-driven digital and transformation strategies. We're looking forward very much to hearing his views on technology, equity, and capacity building for sustainability. Please welcome and enjoy the remarkable Shivam Kishore.
And if you don't know, Shubham has a side business that helps you write the greatest bio you could ever have. So just contact him to get a quote. That's an awesome bio.
I think this is all Richard. I'm listening to this. I'm like, wow, this is impressive. This is very impressive. And then you realize, wait, this is you they're talking about. And I'm like, wait a second, we need to do a readjustment of the reality and perception. But no, it's lovely to meet you all.
Hashtag proud mums, right? Jaisal, could you have one of our prepared questions?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Shivam, I think we have really started the conversation great, the introduction that you have just set in at the start of the event, and to streamline this conversation for our summit, there are some questions that I would be asking you. And the first one would be, how can we effectively translate the principles of do no harm and equity into technological advancements? Thank you.
This is an important one, isn't it? I mean, I think more than translation, I think the word we need to do is how do we amplify it? Because we're already doing it to a very large extent, you see, but it doesn't apply to all sectors of tech. And that is the conversation that we need to indulge in a bit more deeply, because if you look at health tech, you look at civil tech, we do apply principles of do no harm very severely in those sort of technological advancements. Where we get a bit more lax with it is when it comes to the world of emerging tech, where we've become a bit more loose with our ideas and philosophies of fail fast. Yeah, where we have this tendency to create tech with the intention, perhaps many times, of doing good, but we don't account for the externalities or the unintended consequences of creating certain technologies. And that is where I think we've run into the struggle. And I think also a stat that I came across a couple of years ago that's really stood out to me is the importance of taking into account these externalities and unintended consequences in the design phases of the tech creation process. So, for example, the stat said, and this has been sort of confirmed now over the last many years, and it might have become a bit more robust, but about 70% of the end use of a given product can be determined at its design phase. So whether or not a given product is going to be, let's say, for example, going to a waste, or it's going to create harm, can be determined at its very early design phases. And what that says to me is, once we start to design tech, or we start to refine ideas and get into the space of creating new tech, I think that is where we need to take a pause. And we need to transition away from this idea of fail fast to fail fair, which is
Can
where
I just come in onto that, Shivam? Because I guess the point I was making before about programming languages and their kind of energy use is that quite a lot of people in the space of Python admit that when Python was first being created as the language for AI at the time, no one visioned the measures around energy inefficiency. So they created very clumsily a language that has now taken hold. It's quite hard to unstick, and we're paying the environmental price. But people said, had we at that early design phase had been given the task, the grand challenge to create a programming language that was as close to carbon neutral as possible, you know, we might have ended up with a different AI language from its founding moment.
Yeah, and that is such an important point, Paul, and that's exactly it, right? It's taking into account a more holistic framework in the design process when it comes to tech creation and development process. And this is where I think that it's a mindset shift, yeah, because the tech ecosystem, particularly in the emerging market, and I speak this as a technologist who's been in the tech ecosystem for the last 20 years or so, is that is really the mindset that has permeated the tech ecosystem very, very deeply. It's idea of, but let's create tech and we will worry about the challenges that come with it later. But when we come to that later, we've realized that we've created a lot of harm in the way. Now it's hard to roll that back because the technical debt that we've incurred is very high. We have to pause when we start to create. When we start this process of, oh, wait, we see a problem. Can we fix it through tech? That is when we need to take a pause and we need to undertake this process of user centricity and planet centricity, where we say, look, whilst we're creating this, can we take into account the externalities and account for them today? Not later, not when the harm is done, but today, so that we can create better process.
Shivam, sorry, Jason, I see this coming up on all these panels, whether it comes to ethical AI or sustainability, that I think people are seeing, they're smart people are thinking, you know, the free market will figure this out. Like just naturally, the way we'll do things, efficiency, productivity, technology, you know, it'll just kind of work itself out. What are they not factoring? What are they not thinking about, Shivam, when they are allowing that thought? Yeah.
I think it's that balance between intersectionality, right? I mean, most of us as humans are wired to do a task that we are good at. If I've been given a task that my brain has been given or has been attuned to doing or has expertise in, that is my focus and that is what I shall do. The idea of lateral thinking or the ability to look beyond your own perspective, your own roadmap, is a rather difficult undertaking for most human beings. So we are asking quite a lot. And that is where the importance of government regulations of compliancy has been so important in the past. Where that is where the governments have said, look, we expect you to do what you're good at. You're good at creating technologies, you create technologies. We are good at taking the overall holistic view of ensuring that the tech you're creating meets certain standards. So it does what it's designed to do, but it does not create harm in the process. That is what we've done. That is what the role of compliance has been. That is how we need to view the idea of compliance. So the risk management is the same idea. Risk management leads to better compliance. And so, but what we have forgotten in the way is we have started to perceive risk only from a single dimension, and that has been the economical dimension, where we have said risk to an economy or risk to a people or to the planet is only from an economical measure. And so what we have done in that process is we have put in measures that account for economical risks, which means the compliances are all related to the economical measures and dimensions. That has created very many challenges, where we have taken or forgotten to take into account the environmental and social risks, which means we don't have compliance strongly towards environmental and social considerations in the creation of tech. And that is where I think the conversation we're having right now, the whole conversation about ethical AI is the same conversation where we're saying, look, can we take into account the risks of AI creation and generation and dissemination from a social perspective, what does it mean for the society? What does it mean for the planet? And so if we start asking those questions and we start taking those risks into account, then the compliance will follow through. And that is where I think the role of collectively, us as a society, us as a people who care about these things, needs to be more prominent, to bring that up to the policymakers, to influence policymakers, to think about it. I think it's taking agency ultimately. I think we need to shift away from this idea of we just create tech and tech does what it's designed to do, to we are creating tech and it will do what it's designed to do, but it is also a responsibility to ensure that it doesn't do what it is not designed to do. And that part often gets missed and has been missed for a very long time. So I think that is where this balance between free markets and what the markets do, that they're designed to do, but a very important caveat being that they should also then not do what they're not designed to do, which is where the idea of compliance and risk management becomes very important.
I'll ask Jaisal to ask the final question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shivam, I think you have raised wonderful points, and it's like made me really think, because I'm in the tech industry for so many years now, and it's always like we are creating a tech which gives more performance and output than thinking about sustainability first, or human centric and planet centric and design thinking principles, which is changing right now. But yeah, it's really thought provoking what you have said. Moving on to the second question, Shivam, what is the role of technology in economic growth and consumption? How can organizations effectively provoke dialogue?
I think this is where I would invite all the other individuals and experts to join in as well. But I mean, this is, look, we live, one thing that we cannot refute is that regardless of the economies of the parts of the world we are in, by and large, we are already living in an economy that is driven by digital mediums, or we are transitioning towards it at a very, very fast pace. So in the next few years, it is a rather true statement that most of the economy, if not all of it, will be governed to a very high degree by digital channels, which means that we live in a digital economy already. What that means is then that the digital tech and this transformation is impacting the very basic cycles of all economic sectors, whether that's, I mean, all economical sectors, in my view, follow a certain process, and that's of you produce something, you distribute something, and then you consume it, and it's all driven by the financing at the back end. And so all of these together systems are being dictated or driven by tech to a very large extent. So it's already impacting it. So I don't think that the degree to which it will impact, I think, is where the question comes to be. And I feel like that is very much, again, taking agency, where we can't have this conversation of to what extent will tech impact it. The question really is, to what extent do we want tech to impact it? I think that is sort of, in my mind, the more relevant question, because till we keep awarding agency to tech as if it's an entity that is outside human control and outside our own ways of creation, we won't take responsibility for the things that are happening. So we have to start taking responsibility at some point and say that this is the tech that we have created, this is the tech. So what is our role? What do we want the role of tech to be in the future economy? And what role do we want it to play in enabling, whether that's a growth-focused mindset that is premised only on economical dimensions, or do we want it to play a role in enabling newer systems that divorce growth from success or from human well-being? That's where sort of it's totally the question that we need to ask ourselves collectively. I think with so many intelligent humans across the world, and I think it's a shame if we do not take agency of that.
So in summary, do more yoga. Is that your main point?
Ideally, I would say yes, but I think we have to do things beyond the yoga. It's the question of how do we operationalize yoga? That is the key. If yoga is internal, how do we take that and operationalize it so the rest of the world can come along the journey as well?
Yes. Shivam, I know you have to leave on the hour, which is one of the reasons we're making the most of you now as well. Stay with us for just a moment more there. Paul, one of the scariest things about what's happening in Taiwan and Ukraine and so on is the question of whether suddenly war has become better business than commerce. And if we were going to be troubling ourselves about this, we might consider that this period of so-called peace that we've had for decades now is actually simply because commerce has been the better and more profitable than war. The question I'm asking really is how much stability in the world is built on the flawed idea of linear growth that can continue forever?
Well, I think there are alternative models of stability, and if one wanted to look at parts of the world that have had pretty high levels of stability in some ways, I mean, Scandinavia would probably be one example. You will find there more at the government policy level. I'd be interested in here, Shiva. I mean, in some ways, if the ultimate realization of yoga might be tax policy, and in this particular case, it's currently a lot of countries, for example, offer tax relief on innovation if it's going to create jobs. And jobs is perhaps a slightly more benevolent version of growth, because, you think about people and livelihoods than just profit. But, we can get some tax relief. What if at the stage of design, we were offering things like tax relief on environmental benefit, that the innovation, that the technology could demonstrate it takes us a step towards peace? I know some countries are trying to link tax benefit to the sustainable development goals, that you can release government grants and tax-free stuff if you tick maybe certain boxes. But ultimately, Richard, is, do we need to move the ground of stability away from, economic growth towards other metrics that still make sense for people?
Shubham, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think I can speak in my capacity as a technologist and somebody who's thought deeply about the role it can play in enabling sustainable outcomes. And I do think that tying in incentives is certainly something that's very important. And like you said, Paul, many countries are now starting to do this already. We've got, in the North American context, of course, EU, Asia, many countries are also now starting to tie in incentives to promote innovation that premises on environmental and social good. So I think we are starting to see that shift, definitely. I think it's definitely a question, though, of which is where I think I would love to hear from Amanda and Henry and Sophie and any of you actually, is that sort of economical question, where, because we still have this model where fundamentally, and they don't have the answer to this, but fundamentally, we still are living under the premises of an economical system that is single dimensional, where the success of a country or a region or the economy equates to growth. And is there a conversation then to divorce them, or to divorce growth from human? Because the biggest challenge, like we've heard, is with this model is it is good at giving us an economical measure of how well the economy of a country is doing. But once we start to equate economy with quality of life, social equity, environmental progress, that measure fails very quickly. And so do we need a new measure that takes into these dimensions also into account to holistically define what success means, not just economical success? So I think that's where, the conversation becomes very exciting for me. But over to you all.
Sophie, you have your hand up, and then we'll introduce Amanda officially. I've got to stick to the script. Sorry.
I think Amanda unmuted herself first, and I just got distracted by my cat. So if you want to go first, Amanda, I'll stop him from terrorizing first, and then I'll jump in after.
Yeah, there's so much richness that I would love to sort of speak to in terms of what you've been saying, Shivam. The first thing, and just to this question around, growth, war, etc. The issue with GDP and the whole narrative economic growth is it's an aggregate index of all monetary production and goods and services. So it doesn't allow you to question growth of what or why. Yeah. So the thing is, cancer is good for growth, right? Pollution is good for growth. Like there's the military, right? Like, and guns and biochemicals are good for growth. And that's all wrapped up in there together in this aggregate index. And so to this point around war, like I just want to throw out the example of Costa Rica, because I think Costa Rica is a fantastic example of how they got rid of their military expenditure so that they could ensure universal education and health. I think it was back in the 60s, was it? Like after their like civil war. And their whole payment for ecosystem services initiative, where they put a tax of 10% on all oil and gas and fossil fuels, and then use that to subsidize communities that are stewards of the land or are doing regenerative kind of activities, right? Like these are examples of, you know, some of those tax mechanisms that are being used. But for me, what I'm most intrigued by is sort of the points that are being made around the kind of free market logic, this idea of both technology and the economy sort of being presented as these self-evolving phenomena that is separate and distinct from like humanity and our own cognitive like and ethical processes. And that's why we just allow it to sort of go on and then try to deal with it later. And so I'm definitely feel like one of the biggest issues nowadays is people don't learn the history of economic thought anymore. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about like sort of the origins of a lot of these ideas, because it definitely came from a particular context of the classical economists were largely Anglo-Saxon, were coming from a particular philosophy of trying to challenge the legitimate ruling of monarchs and kings or of the church, right? And trying to look at, are there particular qualities of humanity that we could say we can always depend on, and in their framing were the worst aspects of us, that would allow us to view the economy as if it was its own, it'll self-regulate in some way without the need for some sort of collective intention around that system. And like that really snowballs over the coming, you know, centuries in terms of the foundations for sort of like Homo economicus, and you know, and it got more and more and more narrow and narrow. And then it was really just after the Great Depression that, due to the huge inequalities and concentrations of wealth and power by certain corporations and financial institutions, that they developed GNP or GDP, like a system of national accounts. And they were very clear, all of the people who created that, this should not be a measure of our welfare. Yeah. So I really want to give credit to the people who came up with this. It was just supposed to be a measure of economic output. But the thing is that it was in the 1980s and with neoliberalism, and especially with the World Bank and the IMF, that they really saw that there's a strategic value in using GDP, not just as a metric of our progress, but of imposing that on other countries, because ultimately that is a really good way to legitimize encouraging and rewarding the largest investors, corporations, and entrepreneurs who are viewed as the most efficient at supporting that growth. So these newly independent countries would still be open and dependent on multinational corporations, right? Because there was a big movement at that time also to try to create a lot of regulations around those entities. So it serves a strategic function that is beyond just its convenience. Yeah, it's not because it's the best indicator, but also because it does support certain global power dynamics and the perpetuation of certain colonial mindsets, right, that are very much came from a particular elite Anglo-Saxon background. So that's my little rant on this.
Thank you so much. And Sophie, if you're cat free, and then we'll.
Yeah, we threw him outside now. It's a little too hectic. I very much sort of want to build on what Shivam said earlier with designing for sustainability and designing for with an understanding of the impacts of the products and the services that we put into play and we put along, we put into market and into people's hands, and combine that a little bit with this discussion on GDP and economic models or growth models, and more generally, and bring it back to the conversation we had actually in the sort of pre-call to this, where we talked about the narrative of it all and the economic growth narrative that Amanda just thankfully gave us the history around and refreshed our memories around, you know, that it is a narrative, right? It's a structural, it's a construction, it's a construct that's been created and put into society and was at the time what fit with the political motivations. And so for that reason became the dominant driver, right? So from my perspective, what we're looking at here is a narrative change, and how do we collectively push for that new narrative, and what should that new narrative be, right? And I think what Shivam was saying with, you know, with designing and thinking into early stages of products and looking at how do we avoid some of the adverse effects of what we are putting into the world is very much driven by the economic model, whether or not we have time and finances to even do that, right? So yes, we can do that in the interim, and that's what Paul was talking about as well. We're right now in a linear system, we're in an economic growth model. How do we find those steps towards a more holistic approach while being in the current state that we're in, right? And I think that's what it is a step-by-step approach. We need to practically look at what can we do and how can we redesign things and think that into the process in the beginning, but also at a global stage and more in relation to how we measure success and how we then measure those impacts. We need to look at what is the narrative that we're putting out and what is the narrative conversation and the discourse around that, right? And one of the interesting things coming out of something like, for instance, the International Resource Panel and the Global Resources Outlook is looking at decoupling as a concept of saying, well, you know, it's not that we don't like economic growth. It's not that we don't like human well-being or we don't like planetary well-being, but how do we decouple those from each other so that one is not dependent on the other or one is not deteriorating the other, right? So because right now the current growth model, economic growth model that we have is, when you look at the data, it is built upon a degradation or a deterioration of planet and people, right? So how do we decouple that essentially, and how do we sustainabilize in a sense? How do we make economic growth sustainable and sort of hit all of those notes at the same time, right? Rather than it's necessarily being a discussion of disrupting the whole thing and saying, don't want economic growth anymore. I don't think that's necessarily a discussion. It's about the narrative around holistic, as Paul was saying, holistic, multifaceted growth indicators and a growth understanding and a growth narrative, as Amanda was saying, that builds upon more than this economic growth paradigm that was developed in the 80s.
The roaring 80s. Yeah. Sophie, thank you so much. A lot's changed since then.
Richard, I've got a little bit of a kind of pushy question for the panel and for everyone else now, because I guess what we probably need to use at the moment is the word urgency, the urgency around 1.5 degrees and so on. And so I just wanted to kind of throw into the room, at one extreme of a line on sustainability is eco-fascism. You know, we throw people in jail, we even have the death penalty for people that are murdering the planet. At the other extreme, we have eco-libertarianism, where we kind of, you know, people have access to information, but they just make their own decisions, you know, and we just have to, you know, try and encourage them. But somewhere in the middle, hopefully, which is where we might be, are technologies that are available. You're probably all aware of digital nudging, largely used at the moment in marketing, but beginning to be used to nudge people when they're overusing their smartphones, to nudge people to switch stuff off. You know, we could go further. We could start to develop technology that when people are using it in ways that are environmentally unfriendly, it switches off. You could even have technologies of punishment, you know, which moves up more along to the left. But do we need to be using technology, given the urgency at the moment, at least, in a much, much more directive, interventionist way? Or are we all libertarians on this call?
But we must have Amanda's introduction. We must, otherwise we're going to get it right at the end.
I think it's just Richard quickly. I think I think that's a really interesting question, actually, because it's nudging is, I talked about this, Yumi and Amanda in the pre-call, is nudging and marketing, right? Imagine if we use the amount of budget that's used for marketing and nudging in e-commerce, for instance, for sustainability, right? For the sustainability narrative or for human well-being narrative. Imagine if we had that massive budget to do that and how the narrative would shift, right? And it seems like such a simple thing, but because of the current state we're in, the economic growth model that we have, the funds are being put into that, right? But imagine if we could put that same funds into the other narrative. I think it would change significantly. I mean, we're all here probably also because we're pushing for that, but it needs to be more than just.
Yes.
Can I maybe add to this? Because I think one of the most exciting areas where I'm seeing technological innovations is around the intersections with democracy. Because I do think that the concentrations of like wealth and power in the economy are very much intertwined with the concentrations of sort of political power, and a lot of what we're trying to talk, the solutions are about redistributing that power, like, and ensuring greater democracy in the types of decision making and in the prioritizations, and so Barcelona is a really incredible example for me in this regard, because they implemented the Dedisum Barcelona like technology. It's a free technology which is provided to cities or any government, which allows for, after the financial crisis, anybody who's lived in Spain might remember that people were pretty pissed with the government and didn't have a lot of faith, and they were really struggling. And so they pretty much just said, okay, look, we're going to create this participatory platform. You can propose any policies you want. You can debate them, like upvote on them, et cetera, et cetera. And if it gets a certain amount of support, we promise we're just going to pass it, right? And this was a way in which to rebuild trust in the government and to really revitalize a lot of democratic sort of engagement and action. And then a few years later, or maybe this was like a couple years ago, they developed the first city climate plan that was aligned with the Paris Agreement, and that genuinely had like social justice at its heart, because it was not theoretical, it was super practical. So they were like, we know that a lot of old people live in this area, so shade is going to be really important for them in order to deal with and reduce overheating, right? And so the strategy was really ambitious, but also very much aligned to the context. And so this is where, in between, eco-libertarianism or eco-fascism, I think you can find also an intersection of where, through empowering people's direct voice and participation, you can find much more transformative and systemic solutions to both the climate and inequality crises we face.
Thank you both. Jerry, who is this remarkable person that we're hearing from right this moment? If you're there, yes, you are.
So we've been invited to, as an organisation, present the Oscars next year, and we're gonna give everybody the Oscars, and then afterwards tell you who they were. Change in format. So we're enormously proud to introduce our next distinguished panelist. She joins us from the Green Mountain state of Vermont in the United States. She's the Economics and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, WEALL, which is a collaboration of organizations, governments, movements, and change makers committed to designing economies that work in service of both people and planet. She's an economic policy expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. Her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through a well-being-oriented and participatory policy design process. Prior to joining WEALL, Amanda worked for the United Nations and the African Development Bank as an industrial policy and economic systems change expert. As a Fulbright researcher, she explored the relationship between international trade and cooperative enterprise resilience. She graduated from Cambridge University with an MPhil in development studies. I hope she'll continue to sketch out an economic model which focuses beyond gross domestic product and describe the changing role of business therein. Please welcome our distinguished guest, Amanda Janu.
Thank you so much, Jerry. So Amanda, you're obviously hugely welcome, and thank you for your contributions so far. I think David Symes just dropped off and he said goodbye. Shivam, you need to go too?
I do, but I just want to quickly share one thing that might be also make the things that we're talking about a bit more operational, particularly about this conversation of tech, the agency, and the importance of sort of balancing free markets, compliance. What does all of this mean? So I think, like we were saying, I think it's important to recognize that we should give credit where it's due, and tech is good at doing certain things. In fact, tech is good at doing things that is designed to do. It's designed to increase the operational efficiency of a given system. It does that very well. If it is designed to improve the speed at which we hire people, it does that very well. If it's designed to bias decisions based on somebody's skin color, it does that extremely well. So whatever it's designed to do, it does well. The question then becomes really, again, like I was saying before, is how do we put some parameters around it so it does what it's designed to do well, but it doesn't do harm in the process. And so one good example of that operational sort of mindset of what this concept means, I think we can look at, so New York passed this law, and I'm not speaking as a lawyer, but I'm just speaking in a layman's term on what this law is designed to do really is a lot of organizations now across the world are using AI in their hiring processes and to promote individuals within organizations. But as many of you know, a lot of these systems have the challenge of built-in biases into them, where certain sort of skin tones can have a preferential treatment, certain names can have preferential treatment based on the context. And so the algorithms were getting a lot of scrutiny. And so what New York decided to do is they decided to pass a law where every organization that uses or leverages artificial intelligence in their hiring process must first disclose that. And more importantly, they need to undergo an audit of that platform to ensure that there are no biases that are built into the system. And so what that allows us to do, then it allows us to still use that system in a way that is effective and efficient and in the way it was designed to be used, which is improve and better manage the hiring process and take away the inefficiencies that exist, but making sure that there are no unintended consequences in the process. It's very sort of, when we say it, it sounds very obvious and very simple and very of course, but it wasn't of course. It took a lot of conversations and a lot of back and forth for New York as a city to pass this very sort of, I would say, very exciting undertaking. And so I think that's a very simple example of, how we can start to think about these things. It's not complicated so much to do, but it's a matter of, again, taking agency and getting the entities together to do it. So I think that is where sort of I'll leave all of you with. And my apologies, I would have loved to stay on and hear. There's so much collective intelligence all over. So my deepest apologies, but I do have to leave.
Perhaps you'll come back
please do connect,
sometime.
and I'll be happy to chat offline as well about these topics. These are exciting conversations, so all chats are welcome.
Thanks, Siobhan. Namaste.
Bye, Siobhan.
Jaisley, you have a question for Amanda?
Absolutely. I think Amanda has already struck the chord for GDP and the history of GDP. So based on that, my question is, how do you think we can transition from the current GDP focused economic model to a beyond GDP model with social and ecological indicators? I think that's a very important conversation here.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question, Amanda? That's just, maybe I was just looking out the window for a second, but
well, it's just like how do we move beyond GDP and develop all other types of indicators now? So it's been an interesting, I would say, sort of transition where now at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, I'm mostly working with like high income countries that are in sort of this moment of existential crisis where they're like, oh, we have a bunch of money, but everybody's miserable and the planet's on fire, and what's the plan? And so we have these well-being economy governments, for example, which is currently New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, Wales, and Canada. And they've all developed alternative indicators to GDP and alternative national performance frameworks. And they all look slightly different because they've gone through different processes. Like many of them are based on participatory processes where you ask citizens, like in Wales, they ask, what kind of Wales do you want to live for your children and grandchildren, as the foundation for these 7 well-being goals that became their sort of new North Star. Others have done a mix of different sorts of consultancy and research and, like international assessments, etc. but generally they all tend to include a focus on sort of determinants of well-being. So we'd say like health and education, social connection, trust in institutions, like the distribution of that well-being, like across different racial groups, income groups, geographic groups, and then the sustainability of that well-being. So focusing on environmental sustainability indicators like the quality of air and water, but also around the resilience of that system as well. And so those tend to become the sort of overarching new framework for assessing the country's progress by their level of well-being, social and ecological well-being as outlined by those indicators, as opposed to their level of economic growth. Now, I will say, I think one of the challenges that exists when you move from a really simple index like GDP that masks a lot of stuff and it's just your one indicator to moving to like multi-dimensional indicators. And it's the same thing with the SDGs, right? Like there's so many different indicators. Then governments are trying to figure out, how do you make sense of these different dimensions? How do you understand the interrelations between them? And many of the governments still sort of put the social, the environmental, and the economic indicators into a soup together. And then they get a little bit overwhelmed because they're not commensurate, right? Like the economy is a part of society that is embedded within a larger ecosystem, but they're viewing them as if they're equal and comparable in some form. And so I would say Wales is the best example in this regard of really starting from the environmental and social goals, sort of downgrading the economy, and in the sense of saying, okay, how do we assess economic activities and behaviors or technology or finance, et cetera, by its contribution to these higher level goals. But it's a big cognitive shift, because I think Shivam was talking about earlier, like we've held the economy as superior and as the ultimate goal for so long, and the idea that any value can only be reflected in monetary values, that we still have a tendency to try to make the case for why health is good for the economy, rather than feeling like we can swap that burden of proof and say, how would we evaluate the economy in terms of its contribution to our health, right? Like what information would we need about the economy and its performance, different production processes and exchange systems, and which goods and services are positively or negatively contributing to our health, in order to then really proactively sort of encourage and reward those dimensions of the economy accordingly. And so I think a big part of the shift here is not just about like the indicators, because I think a lot of governments now have the indicators, especially if you consider the SDGs, but it's about that next step of that sort of mindset shift. And it's a lot about that longer term thinking and that preventative mindset, right? Like we can't afford to keep doing what we're doing. Like it's just not going to be possible. And governments all over the world realize that, even the richest governments, they're like, we can't afford to keep just putting out fires as they're emerging. And so moving upstream and really thinking about how do we build a system that is regenerative and equitable by design is the question, right? And so rather than just trying to redistribute after the fact or regenerate after the fact. And I would say, I really want to come back to the point, because I think it's an important one that Henry was raising, that it's like, okay, yeah, that's all well and good for Finland to be talking about, well-being indicators. And I'll just say from my experience working in international development and also now working with high income governments, I think the strategies are largely the same, but I think the difference is that lower income countries are much more constrained by our global economic system, and particularly the aid system that is so tied to GDP that like your aid and your like is ultimately going to be controlled to that. Whereas higher income countries are largely constrained by an arrogance that makes them think they don't need a development plan in the first place. Yeah. So the idea of even having a 10-year plan or a vision of where you're trying to go is like way beyond their realm and way beyond the way that institutions are set up. So I think lower income countries or developing countries are actually in a better position because they are used to this idea of having a national development plan in some way to be positioned for that longer term and preventative mindset that's needed for the transformation.
Amanda, the next question that I would like to ask as well, along with some more details, what index can be created that actually takes into effects of any product or service as a whole? taking in previously overlooked externalities like environmental impact, impact of resource on future generations, discounting the value in order to assess its value of the future. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure if I totally understood the question.
What index can be created that actually takes in the effects of any product or service as a whole, taking in previously overlooked externalities such as environmental effect, impact of resource on future generations, discounting the value in order to assess its value of the future?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're talking about an index, there's been a strong movement to sort of like, how do we replace GDP with something that's like kind of equivalent index, right? And so I would say the Genuine Progress Index was probably the closest to what you're asking for, where it still tries to create a monetary value, but to discount for negative environmental impacts and to add for positive social contributions in some way. The Beyond GDP movement really kicked off after the financial crisis, and it was with that Stiglitz report where he and I think he was contracted by Sarkozy and others, were really doing an assessment of, what are these other indicators that we can be using? And they generally agreed that a dashboard is more helpful in some way, right? Because an index really does mask a lot, but it is helpful. Like there's a graph that compares GDP and GPI, and you see that there's you know what I mean? GDP has been increasing almost exponentially, since the 80s, but the Genuine Progress Index hasn't. And so it's good from, I think, a research and maybe an illustration point, but it doesn't really help us much when you're trying to think about, okay, well, what are the specific areas that we then want to be focusing on in terms of policy and practice? I also think that there is still an issue that anytime we're trying to account for the value of people or planet in financial terms, we're sort of missing the point. Yeah. So the thing is that I think we need to start treating environmental indicators in their own relevant units, right? And social dimensions in their own relevant units. And then thinking about, okay, how do we assess the ways in which not just money, but the methods of production and the kinds of economic activities, how those are positively or negatively impacting those. And that's we're a ways away from that. We're still in we know the free market got us here, but let's still use free market thinking to try to deal with it, right? And so there's a big thing around trying to create financial systems of natural accounts, right? To just at least account for the costs of nature. And I think that'll slow it down at least, and maybe it's a bridging strategy. But I think at the end of the day, when you put a price on something, you make it a functionally equivalent. So the idea being that somebody taking care of my mom, it maybe cost $40,000, and so it was equivalent to a fancy patio set, right? And it's can you say that those are equivalent, right? But it makes everything equivalent, and that's what E.F. Schumacher said, is when you put a price on things, you lose its sacredness, because then, yeah, nothing is sacred anymore.
Sophie,
Thank you, Amanda.
Oh, sorry, Jason. I was on the chat. I couldn't see the screen. So let's get your contribution, and then Jerry, if you can very kindly introduce Henry after Karen gives us a very quick update. Sophie.
Thanks, Richard. I was going to mention also actually natural capital accounting and natural resource accounting. I think it's definitely, as you said, it's sort of a bridge of trying to do something with the structures of what economists understand and can grapple with, and what current policies are built around, and how do we speak the language of the ones that are informing policy decisions at the moment, right? And the tools that are currently used for policy decision making. Exactly what you mentioned before with looking at something like GDP versus PI&I or HDI and other types of indicators, and seeing, the ways that one is growing and the other is decreasing was what I was referring to also with the International Resource Panel, this sense of how do we decouple that so that we don't necessarily have that that economic growth on the with the price of everything else, essentially. I think the inform indices, I put them in the chat as well, the inform indices that was developed quite a few years ago now, the Informed Risk Index, quite interesting in disaster management, disaster risk reduction space, but actually the indicators that they're using are really interesting also for general growth and well-being indications and understandings, and the approach that they take is also a dashboard where they do have aggregations, but they provide the opportunity for a dashboard view, and the indicators they pull in there are quite interesting in terms of connecting some of the dots and looking very much beyond GDP, and more so than if you have an index that's specifically like HDI, specifically human development focused or specifically environmentally focused or so on. So I think that's quite interesting. The question that was also in the chat in relation to the design of products and services and the indicators of how to measure that the impact of products and services. For me, it's kind of like I don't know if that's the same thinking for others, but kind of a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing. Are we going to address this at national, global level first in terms of global national indicators like GDP and others? Or are we addressing this first as a, at the product service level and at the production level? Or do we need to address these at the same time? Because right now your design, as we talked about before with Shivam as well, your design processes and the amount of time and financial resources you have for that, and the focus of that is driven by economic growth and economic capital, and then because of GDP, right? But then because everything else is measured on economic growth and GDP, but then if you flip that, then suddenly everything else, which one comes first, or how do we get them in sync and get them parallel so that things are happening at the same time? I think it's very hard to change things when the incentive mechanism is economic growth. And so, while we want to change the indicators of how we track things at a product service level, I don't think we can disconnect that from the earlier conversations, is what I'm trying to say. I think things have to happen in parallel at those two levels.
Yeah, to your point earlier about iterations rather than wholesale U-bend sort of change at the moment. So Karen, who's this MKAI I keep hearing about? Nope. Oh, there you are. You're here.
Yeah.
Can we hear you?
Can you?
Can now?
No.
Sounds, yeah, as Sophie says, it's very quiet.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah,
I will
perfect, perfect, perfect.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I changed
you.
the microphone system. Sorry about that.
It's perfect.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Listen to this thoughtful conversation. It's really enlightening for me to be here. And I want you to introduce the dynamic and inclusive MKAI community. We are a vibrant community of professionals, researchers, enthusiasts, all passionate about AI and its social impact. Whether you are an experienced expert or just beginning your journey, we believe that everyone has a valuable contribution to make. And by connecting to other individuals, sharing insights, engaging in conversation, in thoughtful discussions as we are having today, we can collectively advance our understanding of AI and shape its future too. So I invite you all to join us in our WhatsApp chat. And if you're thinking, oh, okay, this is just another chat, I don't have time to this, I really encourage you to join us and see for yourself that we are more than a chat. We are a safe place to share and learn. And about the timing, well, if you don't have the time to follow the conversations in one particular day, you can read our daily summary, where you can catch up with everything that is happening. So it's really easy and joyful, and come and see for yourself.
I will find out.
We'll just, yeah, we will just place the link on the chat again. And I look forward to connecting with each one of you in our chat. Thank you for your
Thank
attention.
you so much, Karen. It's a great chat. It's about 310 of us. There's 314 of us now, I think, in there. I love being in there, but
About
your
that,
daily
yeah.
your daily summaries are phenomenal that you put out, the
you.
insights. You got to see them. So during the chat, look in the info and you'll see a link to that, and then you'll say, like, you'll probably think what I'm thinking. This is like incredible source of unique perspectives. Jerry, we've got the wonderful Henry Roman, who we met very quickly earlier on, but can you introduce Henry for us, please?
I'd love to, Richard, and thank you, Karen. I'm going to join up right away. That sounds brilliant. Joining us from the city of Johannesburg, South Africa, our next guest is a PhD holder in biotechnology from Rhodes University. He's an expert in acid mine drainage bioremediation, with a 14-year background in the National System of Innovation, including 7 years at the Department of Science and Technology. He's spearheaded the development of South Africa's green economy roadmaps. Most notably, he established the first waste management degree in the country and commissioned groundbreaking reports on green technology and R&D investment. His responsibilities encompass overseeing the South African Risk and Vulnerability Atlas, SAVA, and establishing research, development and innovation platforms for ecological infrastructure in partnership with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI. Additionally, he holds the voluntary position of chair at the International Water Association of Southern Africa, IWASA, a division of WISA, the Water Institute of South Africa, having previously served as treasurer for YWPZA, which is the Young Water Professionals Organization in South Africa. For a fascinating insight into South Africa's circular economy and the role of data, please extend a very warm MKAI family welcome to Dr. Henry Roman.
So first question, Henry, when are you going to put yourself forward for president? That sounds like the kind of person we need. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks, Richard. And yeah, like Shivam, I'm also amazed at my bio. And I think I need to update a few things.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of yours, Henry, having spent time with you. You just emit this great positivity from your work, which is obviously tremendously hard, but you know, you really make it look doable and possible. So thank you for that.
No, thanks. I think you know, what helps in doing the type of work I do is having great teams of people around me that help me to achieve all these various outcomes. There's no ways one person can drive a ship like this.
It's very exciting to see it, and I hope we can stay in touch as well on your journey as you go further into this. James, do you have a question for Henry?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think after hearing the bio, I'm just going to start quickly with the question. It is going to be great to hear to Henry. Can you discuss the use case of waste pickers in South Africa's economy and the challenges which were associated with it that you came across?
Sure, thanks for that, Jay. So I think to start with, and I think Amanda touched on this when she was speaking about moving from monarchies to capital. It's who has the power, or to put it a different way, who's the bully in the room, you know? And when you look at it like that, waste pickers being informal collectors of waste material that has value, who has the power over them? Because they don't fall under anybody's rules. So they're sitting sort of outside the system. And I think that's part of, in a developing economy context, that we need to, that is different to the global north, in that there's this very large informal economy that feeds the formal economy. And it's that distinction, I think, of the global south that we're not tackling it in properly. And that's when we're talking about economic development and well-being economies. These are people who are outside the formal networks, but they're happy. They don't consider themselves as being really poor in our sense of the word. they're working the hours they want to work. They're earning enough money to feed themselves and their children. Some of them are earning enough money to put their children through school, through university. So they're happy. So if you were to do a well-being index on them or a happiness index on them, they'd come out quite high. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. Because what is your metric for what is well-being? So in the work we were doing, so what we were looking at is there's this move to formalize the informal, and it talks again to capital. You want to control everything, right? Because if you can't control it, you can't manage it, and then something is happening beyond you. So we looked at rather integrating the informal into the formal. And that's a slightly different take on how you look at the world. So we're not formalizing, we're integrating. So we're making that system part of the formal system, but not taking it into the formal system, if that makes any sense. The language is failing me a bit here as well. But essentially, there's an interface. So these waste collectors collect materials of value. They sell it on to somebody that owns a buyback center who then pays them for those materials. That person then sells it on to someone else. Now, this is a value chain where the value of that product is increasing as it moves up the chain. So the person at the bottom, being the waste collector, gets the least amount for that material, right? But there's that interface. Once it goes from them into the buyback center, from the buyback center, it's a formal system. And that there are controls and there are measures in place that govern the price that person gets. Nothing governs the price the waste collector is being paid. And there's a very dynamic economy at work, almost like a stock exchange. These guys and ladies too, they know exactly who will pay them the best price on the day for a PET bottle, for example, or an aluminium can. They know this, so they will go to that one person to sell their goods on that day. Tomorrow it's someone else, so then they go to the other person. So they also have a network amongst themselves that operates. And we also found out that a waste collector in Johannesburg, where I live, and by the way, I'm currently in Durban on the east coast of South Africa. I'm here for a Green Youth event that's taking place. And we found that these folks actually move between cities as well. They're not stationary or static and just staying in one place. So they actually move around as well, which we hadn't been aware of. So I'm also not a social scientist or an economist or anything like that. I'm merely a natural scientist dabbling in this new world. But it's been fascinating. I'm learning about these interactions and the complexity of it all. So I've also been part of a well-being economy think tank for Africa, organized by GIZ some years back. So I got exposed to the thinking behind that. And it's fascinating because when you look at the history of the continent, and it probably translates to the history of most developing countries, we were doing that before we got colonized by others. That was the world that operated. And then we were put into the new boxes of every person for themselves. And whoever comes out on top is the winner, kind of thinking, winning at all costs. But we're now realizing that winning at all costs, being economic growth, the implication of that is the world we currently have, that we're now sitting looking at how do we combat 1.5 degree increases. And I left Europe a few weeks ago, where people were saying average temperatures are already 1 degree above where they were before. So things are changing, and they're changing, and it's personally not my government's view, but my view. We've reached that tipping point. We probably passed that tipping point, because if you look at the changes, how rapidly things are changing around us, more typhoons, more hurricanes, more fires. There's just more and more. In South Africa, we're getting more flooding events. We're about to go into an El Nino event, which is going to give us 3 years of the worst drought apparently on record is coming for us. You know, so these things are, and El Nino events were every decade. They're now every 3 years. So everything is rapidly changing around us. And do we have the ability and almost the courage to say, how are we going to change this? Because it's not the global north or the global south that has to make the change. It's the world that has to make the change. And I think that's the dilemma we have. We have COP meetings at enormous carbon footprint every time, and we can't agree on anything. We take 10 years to come to an agreement that we need NDCs, for example. You know, it takes forever to come to an agreement when you're talking about with 100 odd countries. So for us, the learning with the waste pickers is more than just an informal part of our economy. It's making us think of other things. And the ecological infrastructure work that I've been privileged enough to be part of in South Africa is also bringing that complexity of the human interaction with our, and we call it ecological infrastructure. It's commonly known as payment for ecosystem services. Changing the term in South Africa has changed the perspective of the engineers, because our engineers are responsible for the built environment, but changing the term to ecological infrastructure makes them understand that this is an infrastructure you need to operate, you need to maintain, much like you do built infrastructure, and not allow it to deteriorate. So, and that then speaks to well-being as well, because what we found was in areas where we started practicing some of these principles, the improvement in the ecological state led to an improvement in people's economic value at the same time. So, or economic status, let me put it like that. So by increasing by improving the ecological state, you improve the economics, let me put it like that, of that region. So people started making more money off of nature, started becoming more prosperous, but not at the expense of the natural environment they find themselves in. So yes, maybe it works well in rural settings and may not work as well in an urban one, but as most of us in the circular economy know, that's where the circular economy is going to have to be implemented, is in your urban spaces, because that's where the damage is done. So I think for me, this event has been fascinating. I've got, my head is spinning with so many ideas and so much thinking at this point. But I think in terms of the waste pickers, that's sort of, I think globally, India, Brazil, South Africa, most of the continent of Africa, we're all grappling with how do we make it livable for these folks as well, protect them at the same time. We had an incident in South Africa a few weeks back where there was, on a landfill site, part of the landfill had collapsed and 6 people lost their lives. So these things are real. And there's value in waste. We also have an incident that made the papers not too long ago, where gangs are now shooting people who are coming to collect products that have value, on landfill sites. So wow, things are quite hectic in the space at the same time. But these are the complexities we have to deal with, as not just as a country, but as a globe. Because informal economies are coming to Europe as climate refugees. So I think it's something to keep in mind as well.
Henry, that's really interesting, but I think Amanda wants to add something to your point. So I would ask Amanda. Amanda, you have been nodding, and I think something is interesting you in this topic, and I would like you to add your comments.
Yeah, no, I love everything. Henry, I would love to just learn a lot more about the kind of examples, because I do think, especially within the circular economy, it's so often based on a Denmark model of very high tech, capital investment led. And from my experience, right, the community I lived in India was like, had the most circularity I'd ever seen because of, you know, like the waste pickers and just the constant reuse and repurposing. And I would love to know if you have any other examples of where you've seen this, where like governments are purposefully sort of institutionalizing that as core to their sort of their circular economy sort of strategies, and sort of the ways in which they're doing, or if you've written anything on this. I would just love to read it, because I know the EU is positioned to pass a legislation soon, which is going to require that any products that enter into the market have certain reuse, redurability, recycled like requirements, and that's going to transform the landscape. Because honestly, like in the US, we don't know how to repair anything anymore. Yeah, like we just don't have the skills or capacities to do it, and so we're not going to be in a good position to compete in a global market if those sorts of requirements become the standard, you know. And I do really appreciate the point, and I want to make this very clear as well around, you know, the vision of a well-being economy being what was in Africa prior to colonization. I think I am always very cognizant, although the movement is very strong in high-income countries, that like it's not new, it's not our own. It comes from like indigenous and alternative development paradigms, like Ubuntu, right, where you're based, or Swaraj, or Buen Vivir, like other philosophies that are much more systems thinking in their nature, much more grounded and connected to the earth and the things that sort of matter as a whole. And I'll just share a little anecdote that for me, probably one of the most profound moments was I was working in Mozambique, and there was this economist who was explaining to me that, you know, like our development, like it's going to take time for their culture to change in order to achieve the entrepreneurial sort of development of America. Because, you know, investors will come and people will show up for a day or two, come to work, and then they'll just leave, right? And they won't come back for another few weeks, sometimes a month, whatever, until they need more money. So the conclusion, they lacked a work ethic. And I had this moment of being like, no, they have a culture that understands how much is enough. Yeah, like in the United States, there is no concept of enough. Like the notion of ambition is so core to our identity, right? Like you always need to be striving for more. And even if it's not material, it's in some way like about achieving more. And so at that moment, I was like, look, I got a lot more to learn than I do to teach about how to build like genuinely sustainable economic systems or societies, because the US in GDP terms is by far, you know, like the most successful developed country in the world, and people are miserable here. Yeah, like I lived abroad for a long time, and coming back, that's been the major thing. The anxiety, the depression is rampant, right? And if that's not a sign of a broken system, yeah, I don't know what it is. But thank you.
I'm just going to add to that and maybe come back to Henry, because spot on, Amanda. I mean, people are documenting the cost to health services of tech anxiety, and particularly upgrading anxiety is a well-documented thing. I was interested, Henry, right at the start of your kind of response, which is in the concept of GDP, you mentioned words like well-being, and you mentioned the word enough that Amanda has picked up on. And it's extremely documented that the tech wave right back to the late 1990s was that advertising was addressing itself to people to disrupt their sense of well-being, to say you don't have enough. You thought you had enough, but your phone isn't big enough. You don't have enough memory. And things are still engineered with the assumption that marketing needs to disrupt people's sense of enough. All the time. And I'm just interested also that the actual nature of design itself, that the selling points of, say, the new iPhone is it's now got 512 gig or 1 terabyte. And so the assumption is that we begin with something that's empty, and the goal is to fill it up. And, you know, when we talk about battery size, which is a huge environmental cost with the lithium mines popping up all over the world, you know, it's a 5,500 mAh battery. And what it sells it on is that means if you use it all day, it'll still be working in the evening. Whereas the culture of enough is it's a 5,500 battery and it'll last you for 6 months. You know, so I just wonder, you know, whether you had any thoughts around what would the technologies of enough look like compared to the technologies of not enough?
I think they're very interesting points. I think quickly to respond to Amanda, what we're doing in developing out our STI for circular economy strategic plan, it must be in our context. I've been to Europe, I've seen what they're doing, I've seen the new Green Deal, you know, looked at literature from everywhere. And for me, it's very important that we do it in our context, much like India has and China has as well. China's not spoken of too often in circular economy terms, but just for the record, 2008, they put out the first document as a government looking at circular economy. So for me, the in context is extreme, and you're right. It's because we need to look at these two economies. If you come to South Africa and you come to Johannesburg, it's like going to LA or going to New York. The infrastructure is the same, connectivity, everything. It's like you're in a first world place. You just go 200 meters down the road and there's a slum. Nothing is like Sandton, which is right there. It's like the rest of Africa, literally, you know, and it's side, and these things live, these two economies live side by side, day in and day out. So our context has to be addressed if we go in circular. We cannot do it in a European way entirely. So that's the one. You know, what America's been really great at is that you don't have enough concept. It's translated everywhere. I mean, these, what they call them, social influencers. You know, these people drive consumerism like no one's business, and they get paid to do it. And it's taken hold here in South Africa as well. I mean, my kids are telling me they want to be YouTubers, and I'm like, what is that? And then they explain it to me, and they say, these guys make millions telling people how they play games. And so they push gaming. And then we had this thing of Prime, the energy drink, that took South Africa by storm for all of about 2 weeks, mind you, because the stuff is not that tasty. So people didn't buy it after the rush to have it, because these media influencers said it's important that you have this thing. So that culture of you don't have enough, it's becoming pervasive. And even here, I mean, now people want the next best BMW, Mercedes-Benz, the best Nikes, whatever is the latest cultural brand. But I think one thing, and I don't know how many people are like me around the world, but when I was looking for a smartwatch, I looked for a watch with a battery life that will be long, that will give me the bare minimum of what I want from a smartwatch. And I'm looking for a watch that's going to track my exercise, etc. And when I go hiking, it must be able to tell me where I am or map out my course or whatever. And the watch I settled on has a 2-week battery life compared to 3 days if you have these very fancy watches that do all these 500 things that you don't need, you know. And I think that's maybe some way to look at things. Is I heard this term yesterday, which was really, it stuck with me. We were talking about the digitization of municipalities and the water sector. And the guy mentioned, he said, don't boil the ocean. So if you need a cup of coffee, don't boil the ocean. Do what is required and only that. Or buy what you need and only that. You know, that sort of thinking is what we need. But again, we can use the social media influencers to that end. They did very well with plastic straws. You know, they shifted, entire world got shifted. Plastic straws are terrible for the environment, and plastic straw is so bad. The question you have to ask yourself, is it the straw that's bad? Or is it us that can't manage that straw properly? So now we shifted to paper straws. That's the same thing. But now we've got a whole lot of paper straws. Well, what are we going to do with it? How are we managing them properly? So it's that type of thinking, I think, that, you know, if we can bring it through the school system, systems thinking is not taught at school. It's very linear. What we are taught, it's like you must get from grade 1 to grade 2 to 3 to 4. But everything you do builds on everything else. But when you look at a kid, and if they're 5 or 6 years old, you ask them a question, they're thinking about the world holistically. And we're teaching them to think about the world with blinkers on. Is that the way we want to, are we producing more of the same in this new world we're going into, where complexity and systems thinking is what will get us out of the mess we created for ourselves? Linear thinking is not going to get us there. We know that. It's now apparent. Economies are shifting to accommodate that thinking. But we're still not training people to think the way they need to think. So in a linear world, we want to put in a circular thinking, but we're not training people to be circular thinkers from a young age, because that's where the creativity lies. It doesn't lie with people like myself. You know, gray-haired folks are not the ones that will change the world. We're the ones that created the world we're in. And so we need to give the tools, and I purposefully say tools now, because AI is a tool, machine learning is a tool. We need to see these things. Data science is a tool. These are tools to help us do things better. But as was spoken about, the ethics around AI, we need to create the system that allows the tool to be seen as a tool and not everything. And if we keep it as a tool, I think we can change things. But like I said, people my age, maybe not so much. Younger people with more creativity. And we do a lot of hackathons now to solve problems. It's not just South Africa, it's all over the world. Hackathons are really useful. Put some young people in a room for 2-3 days and they come up with some really amazing things to solve your problems. But then you must enable them to solve the problem, not just to have a hackathon and a report that comes. And like the UN, sorry for the UN, but to say this, but declarations are meaningless unless they're implemented.
Henry, you talk about systems thinking being taught in, kind of foundational, let's go back to the roots in education. Do you think we should go further given the urgency again? Should children be much more overtly encouraged or exposed to a critique of growth, a critique of GDP-driven kind of target setting? Is that something they just discover later, or even in primary school, do they need to be being exposed much more to sustainability arguments?
Personally, I think they should be exposed to sustainability arguments from primary school. I'm actually part of a group in South Africa responding to UNESCO, where we want to build environmental sustainability into the curriculum at school level, primary school and high school. So UNESCO are definitely thinking about it. But I think the exposure is what we need, but it must be done in a good way. I'm not an education specialist by any means, but I think the idea, the concepts should be taught and then built upon as we going as they get older. Because even my kids, when they learn about the things I talk about, because I don't take work home if I can help it, is climate change is real for that generation. They realize it's something that's happening, something that can be changed by behavior. So going into a shop, buying things with lots of packaging, you get questioned about it. When things are delivered to your house in one small cardboard box with 5 million pieces of plastic inside it to protect a thing the size of a thumbnail, questions are raised. So that's how you start, where citizens can impact producers. We can tell them we don't want that packaging. We don't have to take it. But we are conditioned to, like I said before, who's the bully in the room? We're conditioned to follow what the societal norm is. And the societal norm, unfortunately, at the moment is not helping us as a species on the planet either.
Wow, the problem, Henry, is that listening to you, I forget that we're in a forum. I just think we're on a podcast or watching a movie. It's just incredible just to sit back and just listen to the way that you structure things and the way you relate to things and the way that you explain things. It's truly a gift to be in your company, Henry. Thank you for everything you've said, and that
Thank you so
profound
much.
thought. Well, about the plastic straws. Is the problem the plastic straws or our inability to know what to do with them? It's such a simple thought, but one I hadn't really focused on before. I'm conscious of time, and we're coming up to 10 minutes to the hour, and Sophie has contributed, fortunately, numerous times in this event. But Jaisal, well, Jerry, if we can have our intro, and Jaisal, if we can have sort of one specialist question for Sophie as well, to make sure that we make some time available for her. She's such a special person.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Richard. Last but not least, our final wonderful panelist joins us from Denmark. She's the Digitalization Coordinator at the One Planet Network, a multi-stakeholder initiative hosted by UNEP alongside more than 700 actors from governments, businesses, and civil society, international organizations, and the scientific community. Here, she spearheads One Planet Network's circular economy digitalization efforts, leveraging digital technologies to accelerate the transition towards a more sustainable future. She now leads their efforts on digitalization for the circular economy, a new expert-driven impact initiative focused on harnessing the potential of digital technologies to accelerate the shift to the digitalization for the circular economy, a new initiative focused on harnessing the potential of such technologies to accelerate the shift through effective digital business models, global standards, and enabling public policies. She's an expert in digital forums, in digital platforms, data analysis, and business development. Her passions include digital technologies, strategy, data and evidence-based planning and program management, and partnership development for sustainable development, natural resource use, and disaster risk management. Addressing data availability, process design, and the shift in the narrative for us, we're so lucky to have her here with us again. It's an honor and privilege to invite you to meet again and welcome Sophie Turk-Clausen.
Thank you very much, Harry. And again, I'm going to echo what the others said. I might need you and the team to write my LinkedIn profile moving forward. That sounds very impressive. Thank you so much.
So, Sophie, the first question, because of lack of time, I'm going to be quickly asking that. How can industries and governments better facilitate the availability of data necessary for a shift towards a circular economy?
Thanks, Jaisal. And I think, you know, just quickly, maybe before answering that question, I just want to, you know, re-emphasize some of the points that Henry made. I think, you know, it's a very interesting case around waste management, and more in general, also, as you mentioned, Henry, this idea of what is it that we actually value in our lives and put value to as individuals and as families and as communities, and how do we start to measure that and use that as an indication of well-being and happiness essentially on the planet, right? Isn't that what we should be measuring ourselves on rather than necessarily how much money we have in the bank, right? Bhutan, obviously a couple of years ago, or quite a few years ago, did the happiness index as a way forward, as proposed way forward for that. We do have, you know, the happiest nations in the world index coming out every year in terms of, you know, seeing what is it that people actually value and how do we understand our lives more at its core right now. I think that's what's interesting about the world, the work that Amanda is doing, the work that you're doing, Henry, at the national level as well, is just trying to rethink what we actually mean about well-being. Conceptually and the understanding of that, and taking it back, as you said, to the core of it. You know, as just a completely personal example, I used to live in a nice apartment, had more space than I needed, and because that was sort of the idea of what you thought, you know, the path of youth in Denmark was like, you get this big apartment, you get this nice apartment because now you can afford it, right? And we made the decision a couple of years ago to now live in a tiny house community and prioritize air and gardens and community around us, right? And making those decisions to shift away from this overconsumption or this idea of we need more, towards more of what Paul was talking about with, what is enough and when do we have enough and why do we keep pushing beyond enough, right? To your question, Giselle, around how do we facilitate the access of data and the availability of data and use data for that matter along the value chains in shift to a circular economy, right? I think the value chain aspect of that is quite important. This is something that we're working on in the One Planet Network through this Digitalization for Circular Economy Impact Initiative, trying to get a multi-stakeholder group in a room that work on this from different angles and to try to understand actually how is it that we combine the joint efforts of different types of stakeholders, the governments, the businesses, the scientists, the academia, the civil society, and individuals, and within different thematic areas to really understand what kind of information do we need to transfer along value chains? What's the information that will drive sustainable change? And how do we do that? And how do we access that data? How do we make address some of the data gaps that we had? In the last event, we actually talked quite a lot about this around the data gaps and how do we understand data along value. I think at the end of the day, this is not a single actor that's going to change the game. It needs to be a series of changes and compromises from different types of actors in this space. There is obviously right now a huge monopolization and sort of monopolization on data from the business sector and the private sector in relation to obviously privacy of business secrets and so on, but also in terms of the value that we're putting on data, the financial value that we're putting on data, right? So suddenly data is something you can buy, right? It's a commodity now. So how do you get that into a public service, open source value chain to get that data out for decision making, for circularity? And I think that's where it comes in to a collaboration between the public and the private sector. There needs to be a facilitation of the transfer of data along value chains and the way that we transfer in the regulations around that. As Amanda mentioned before, there's steps that are being taken right now in the European Union. It's happening quite fast. Each day it seems like they're approving new regulations around the sharing of information along value chains, in particular in the area of circular economy. And it's also happening simultaneously with digital passport examples, both in the EU and in China. So there are things that are happening to drive towards that area, but it has to be a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And for somehow we need to, and I would be really interested to, in the last 3 minutes we have, to understand from others any ideas around how do we free up this new concept of I was always going to call it data for hire, but like paying for data, right? Putting data on market. Was that a huge mistake? How do we backtrack that? How do we rephrase data to be a public good and a public service, a common service and open source thing? That's one of the big things we're going to have to grapple with if we're going to change the current systems that we have. So I'm going to stop there and allow for 2 minutes of maybe thoughts on that point.
Sophie, thank you so much. I'm glad that we were able to squeeze that into the last few minutes for sure. What I'll do now is we're coming up 2 minutes to 6 here in the UK. So we will officially close our meeting in terms of our prepared answers and comments and contributions, and obviously show some gratitude. And then I'm going to keep this session open because we want to collect more ideas. I've just put in the chat there that with the power of GPT now, we're able to really get this stuff out. So we're able to get it out of these rooms and into the social sphere and to LinkedIn and other places like that to accelerate and amplify the ideas that come out of this. Obviously, I don't share anything that seems personal. That's clearly, it goes through the human filter. I think I probably know what things need to be internal, external, so you can count on our management of that. But otherwise, we really want to spread these ideas. So thank you so much, Sophie. Starting with you again, you've been such a supporter of this event today, previous events. I don't know if we're talking about the fact that you're transitioning soon. I don't know if that's public, but
that's okay. That's public information. It's happening on Friday. I've been working with Henry as well. Henry's not aware, but now you are, Henry, that I'll be leaving the One Planet Network Secretariat, and I'll be handing over my work, of course, to our deputy head, Adriana Zacharias, who will be taking forward our impact initiative. So anyone here on the call involved in our impact initiative, it will be taken forward by others that are very excited to continue the work in the team, and of course continue the linkages with codes that Shivam is a part of as well.
Yeah, so I don't exactly know what Sophie's plans are at this point in the last sort of 48 hours since we haven't spoken, but if you've resonated with what she's been saying, I would definitely suggest reaching out, because I think she is at least in some part open to different futures and opportunities. So definitely reach out to her on LinkedIn or anything else she wants to share. So thank you so much, Henry, as well, for all the prep that you did on this, the conversations we had before. I actually shared our notes, I hope that's okay, into the chat there just a moment ago, because I think they were so interesting, the calls that we had before this. I wished more people had seen those. Amanda, too, thank you so much. Your enthusiasm and positivity for this event and all the things that you've shared have made this tremendously interesting, I think, for me, and I certainly hope for others. Obviously, we thank Shivam as well, who's been around. Shivam's interested in joining our advisory team as well, which will be exciting development in the future. We'd be honored to have someone like him. Jaisal, thank you so much for preparing the questions and diving into some specific areas. Without you, it would just be me meandering into what about this and what about that, which is not the best way to run an event. Jerry, thank you so much as well for preparing those wonderful bios that we heard from all the speakers. And Paul as well, of course, for your interjections on these kind of things that have sparked not only some great conversations here, but obviously the chat's been lighting up with your really creative and brilliant ideas. We love having you on this journey with us, Paul. Thank you so much for being a huge part of it.